Power rarely introduces itself. It waits quietly inside documents everyone else forgets to read. On a cold November evening, the Ashford Grand Hotel stood illuminated beside Central Park, welcoming global investors and diplomats to Ashford Hospitality's annual expansion gala. Cameras gathered near the entrance, waiting for the man everyone believed owned the empire. Daniel Ashford walked through the lobby with effortless confidence. At 50, the white billionaire had become the public face of the rapidly growing luxury hotel company. Executives straightened as he passed. Reporters followed his every step. Investors greeted him with admiration reserved for men who seemed incapable of losing. Daniel accepted every compliment naturally. Years of headlines had convinced him that visibility and ownership were the same thing. A few moments later, Monica Ashford entered through the private resident entrance. At 42, the elegant black woman wore a burgundy cashmere coat over a simple black evening dress. She acknowledged longtime employees with quiet nods, receiving genuine respect rather than practiced admiration. The hotel's oldest concierge smiled warmly as she passed. Monica noticed what everyone else ignored: the brass directory displaying the newest expansion, the architectural rendering, and the antique skeleton key preserved beneath glass. Most guests saw decoration. Monica saw history. Years before the Ashford Grand became the centerpiece of Daniel's hospitality empire, another event had taken place in a quiet law office overlooking Madison Avenue. There had been no photographers or champagne. Only a property deed, a fountain pen, and a carefully designed family trust created to protect the land beneath the hotel for generations. The original deed never left secure custody. It outlasted companies, executives, and headlines. Standing beneath the grand chandelier, Monica watched investors congratulate Daniel as if the hotel belonged entirely to him. She offered no objection. She had learned long ago that arguments rarely changed minds. Records did. As her eyes drifted toward the private executive elevator, she noticed two attorneys carrying locked documents. Cases embossed with the discreet crest of Ellison Property Trustees. They disappeared upstairs without attracting attention. Daniel never noticed them. Neither did the reporters surrounding him. Monica did. She simply watched the elevator doors close before turning back toward the ballroom. Somewhere inside those sealed cases rested documents capable of separating authority from ownership. No one else in the room realized that the distinction would soon matter. By every public measure, Daniel and Monica Ashford had built the perfect marriage. Business magazines praised them as the couple behind one of America's fastest-growing luxury hotel empires. Daniel stood beneath the spotlight, delivering keynote speeches and ringing stock exchange bells. Monica rarely appeared beside him, preferring foundation work and quiet philanthropy. To the public, Daniel was the visionary. Monica was simply his elegant wife. Few people knew the truth. 21 years earlier, Daniel had possessed ambition, charisma, and an extraordinary instinct for business. Monica possessed something even more valuable. She understood corporate law, trust structures, and the difference between controlling a company and owning its foundation. While Daniel negotiated financing, Monica drafted operating agreements, reviewed land titles, and built legal structures designed to protect every major asset they acquired. When a neglected landmark hotel near Central Park came onto the market, most investors walked away. Daniel saw a flagship hotel. Monica saw the land beneath it. She insisted that the property be divided into two separate layers. Ashford Hospitality Group would operate the hotel, manage employees, and generate revenue. The land itself, however, would be transferred into the Ashford Family Property Trust, protected by carefully drafted ownership provisions. Daniel trusted her completely. He signed every document she prepared without questioning the legal details. At the time, the structure seemed overly cautious. Monica simply called it responsible planning. Years passed, and the decision quietly disappeared beneath success. The Ashford Grand became one of the most profitable luxury hotels in the country. New properties opened across Europe and Asia. Television interviews celebrated Daniel as the architect of the empire, while Monica willingly stepped farther into the background. She never corrected reporters. She never claimed credit. Headlines celebrated operators. Records remembered owners. Success changed Daniel in ways neither of them noticed at first. He began believing the admiration surrounding him reflected ownership rather than leadership. He treated board meetings as formalities and legal documents as paperwork someone else would always handle. Monica noticed the shift, but said nothing. She continued serving on the family foundation, reviewing trustee correspondence each year alongside routine charitable work. One evening, before leaving for another investor dinner, Daniel smiled as he watched Monica close a slim leather portfolio. "You still carry documents everywhere," he joked. Monica returned a faint smile. "Important things deserve records." Daniel laughed softly, kissed her goodbye, and walked out without asking what was inside. After the door closed, Monica placed the portfolio inside a secure cabinet. It contained routine trustee correspondence, annual compliance reports, and one sealed envelope from Ellison Property Trustees. She left it unopened. Some protections were most effective because everyone assumed they would never need to be used. The following Friday evening, the Ashford Grand Hotel became the center of Manhattan's luxury world. Investors, politicians, and hospitality executives gathered beneath its soaring chandeliers to celebrate the newest global expansion. Every guest expected Daniel Ashford to deliver another flawless performance. He did not disappoint. Wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo, Daniel moved effortlessly through the ballroom, greeting investors, posing for photographs, and accepting congratulations as though the evening had been created solely for him. Every lens found him. Every conversation paused when he entered. To everyone watching, he looked like the unquestioned owner of the empire. Monica arrived quietly through the private entrance a few minutes later. Dressed in a simple burgundy evening gown, she acknowledged familiar employees before taking her place near the edge of the ballroom. Several longtime staff members greeted her with genuine warmth, but few guests noticed her arrival. She preferred it that way. As she crossed the lobby, she paused briefly beside the display case containing the hotel's original skeleton key and the framed survey map of the property's historic boundaries. The symbols reminded her that every great building stood on a foundation few people ever thought about. Upstairs, inside the presidential collection, Vanessa Cole prepared for the evening. At 29, the striking black model had quickly become Daniel's newest public companion. A concierge delivered an exclusive guest credential identifying her as Daniel's personal guest. She smiled as though it represented a permanent place in his world rather than temporary access. Minutes later, the private elevator descended into the ballroom. Daniel stepped out first before extending his hand toward Vanessa. Camera flashes exploded across the room. Reporters rushed forward. Investors exchanged knowing smiles. Daniel placed an arm confidently around Vanessa's waist and guided her through the center of the ballroom, as though introducing a new queen to his kingdom. Monica watched from across the room without moving. Daniel noticed her only for a brief moment before turning back toward another photographer. He seemed almost relieved by her silence. To him, silence meant surrender. Vanessa walked proudly beside him, believing the attention belonged to her now. When photographers asked for one final picture, Daniel escorted her back toward the private elevator leading to the presidential collection. The message required no explanation. Everyone watching understood exactly what he wanted them to believe. As the elevator doors closed, applause filled the ballroom once again. Monica remained where she was, her expression calm. Her eyes rested not on Daniel or Vanessa, but on a small bronze plaque beside the elevator. It displayed the legal name of the trust responsible for preserving the historic property, a detail almost no one ever noticed. She allowed herself the faintest smile. Before turning away, the people celebrating upstairs believed they were witnessing the beginning of a new chapter. Monica knew they were standing at the end of one. The orchestra softened as Daniel guided Vanessa toward the center of the ballroom. Conversations faded. Every camera turned to follow them. The evening was no longer about expansion. It had become a public display of Daniel's confidence and his betrayal. Monica remained near one of the marble columns, watching in complete silence. She neither approached nor looked away. Daniel welcomed the attention. After thanking several investors, he raised his champagne glass and spoke just loudly enough for the nearest reporters to hear. "Success belongs to people willing to embrace the future," he said with an easy smile. "Some people mistake yesterday's success for tomorrow's relevance." The remarks sounded harmless to outsiders, but those who knew the Ashfords understood exactly who it was meant for. A few executives exchanged uneasy glances. Longtime employees lowered their eyes. Vanessa smiled proudly, believing the words celebrated her. Daniel believed the room admired his courage. In reality, many simply chose not to react. Monica didn't react. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and continued observing the room. She noticed the discomfort on the faces of employees who had helped build the Ashford Grand from its earliest days. She recognized the quiet respect they still offered her, even while pretending not to witness the humiliation unfolding in front of them. Daniel accepted their silence as approval. Confident he had complete control of the evening, he escorted Vanessa toward the grand staircase leading back to the presidential collection. Before they reached the elevator, Vanessa glanced over her shoulder and met Monica's eyes. She offered a small, confident smile, believing she had already taken Monica's place. Monica answered with a polite nod. As Vanessa disappeared into the elevator beside Daniel, Monica's attention shifted to the bronze plaque mounted beside the doors. Engraved beneath the hotel's dedication date was a line almost every guest ignored: property preserved. Under the Ashford Family Property Trust. She remembered approving the wording years earlier, never imagining how important it would one day become. The elevator doors closed. Applause returned almost immediately, and the orchestra resumed playing as though nothing unusual had happened. Around the ballroom, conversations recovered. Investors discussed expansion plans. Reporters prepared tomorrow's headlines. Daniel believed he had just won the final battle for public opinion. Monica placed her untouched glass onto a passing tray and turned toward the exit. As she passed the hotel's elderly concierge, she paused for only a moment. "Enjoy the building while you still can," she said softly. The concierge looked at her in surprise, sensing there was more behind the words than he could understand. Monica offered a courteous smile before walking away. She never looked back. Behind her, the celebration continued beneath glittering chandeliers, but for the first time that evening, the Ashford Grand no longer felt like Daniel's stage. It felt like a building patiently waiting for its true story to be remembered. By the next morning, the photographs had spread across every major financial publication. Headlines celebrated Daniel Ashford's bold expansion plans almost as enthusiastically as they discussed the younger woman seen leaving by his side. Television commentators praised his confidence. Business analysts described him as a leader focused entirely on the future. Investors responded just as positively. Ashford Hospitality Group's stock opened higher, and financial news outlets predicted another record year. To Daniel, the previous evening had been a complete victory. Inside the executive boardroom overlooking Central Park, directors congratulated him on securing preliminary approval for the company's most ambitious project yet, a $900 million acquisition of a historic luxury resort overlooking Lake Como. Charts filled the presentation screens. Revenue forecasts exceeded expectations. Applause followed nearly every announcement. When the meeting ended, the board unanimously authorized management to proceed, subject only to the lender's standard closing requirements. Daniel barely noticed the legal wording. He had heard it at the end of countless successful transactions. Across the city, Monica spent the same morning inside the family foundation, reviewing scholarship applications and restoration grants. Unlike Daniel's office, there were no cameras, no interviews, and no celebrations. Shortly before noon, her assistant placed a sealed envelope from Ellison Property Trustees on her desk. Monica opened it quietly. Inside was a formal notice explaining that the Lake Como financing would use the Ashford Grand as its primary collateral asset. Attached was a legal memorandum highlighting a clause she had drafted more than 20 years earlier, Property Transfer Restriction, Section 8.3. She read the paragraph without surprise. The clause was simple. Any new loan secured by property held inside the trust required written approval from both the acting trustee and the registered beneficial owner before the collateral could be pledged. Earlier expansions had cleared preliminary diligence because they relied on operating revenues and corporate guarantees. This time, final collateral review required direct trustee authorization because the underlying land was being pledged. This transaction was different. Monica closed the memorandum. Daniel had not violated the trust. He had simply assumed his authority as CEO extended to every layer of ownership beneath the company. It never had. She called Margaret Ellison. Has the financing syndicate requested trustee consent yet? Not yet, Margaret replied. Their lawyers are still completing collateral verification. Monica lowered the page. Then nothing changes until they ask. Exactly, Margaret answered. If the request comes, we'll follow the agreement exactly as written. Monica thanked her and ended the call. There would be no confrontation, no public accusation, and no emotional revenge. The trust had been created to remove emotion from decisions involving the family's most valuable asset. Meanwhile, Daniel stood before another group of investors, accepting congratulations as though the Lake Como acquisition had already been completed. He believed every obstacle was behind him. Buried in the financing package was one final condition. It did not depend on market confidence, board approval, or Daniel's reputation. It depended on a signature from the person everyone had already forgotten. The following afternoon, Monica arrived at the offices of Ellison Property Trustees, a discreet building that revealed nothing of the fortunes it protected. Unlike Daniel's headquarters, there were no cameras in the lobby, no company logos, and no reporters waiting outside. Wealth was managed here with discretion, not publicity. Margaret Ellison welcomed Monica into a private conference room where a single archival case rested on the walnut table. Inside were the original documents created 21 years earlier, the recorded property deed, the trust agreement, the beneficial ownership register, and Section 8.3 that governed every major decision involving the land. Margaret opened the file carefully. The preliminary review is complete, she said. Now their lawyers need trustee authorization. Monica read the accompanying memorandum in silence. The Ashford Grand would serve as the primary security for the Lake Como acquisition. That single decision automatically triggered the restriction. Margaret slid another page across the table. Under the trust, the land cannot be pledged as collateral without written approval from both the trustee and the beneficial owner. Monica nodded. She had written those words herself decades earlier, never imagining they would one day determine the future of the company's largest expansion. Has anyone contacted the trustees? She asked. Not yet, Margaret replied. The banks are verifying title before requesting formal consent. Without another word, the file closed in Monica's hands. Then we wait. Margaret studied her for a moment. You understand what will happen if the request arrives. The trustees will follow the agreement, Monica answered. Nothing more. Margaret gave a small nod. That was exactly how the trust had always been intended to function. It protected assets through rules, not emotions. Before Monica left, Margaret unlocked another compartment inside the archival case. Resting inside was the original fountain pen Daniel had used to sign the trust documents. Beside it lay the original property deed, preserved in archival sleeves. Monica looked at both for a long moment, but did not touch them. Some documents gained power every year they were ignored. Across town, Daniel spent the afternoon finalizing presentations for the acquisition. His executive team reviewed financing schedules while outside counsel discussed closing dates with international lenders. The atmosphere remained optimistic. Every milestone had been completed on schedule, and the remaining legal work appeared routine. During the meeting, the company's chief financial officer mentioned that the banks were conducting final collateral verification. Daniel barely looked up from the presentation. Standard procedure, he said. Nothing unusual. The room moved on without another question. No one realized that the final verification involved more than confirming ownership records. It required determining whether the operating company possessed the legal authority to pledge the land beneath its most valuable hotel. As evening settled over Manhattan, Monica returned home carrying only her leather portfolio. She placed it inside the same secure cabinet and closed the door without opening the documents again. She would not make the next move. The trust would. Somewhere inside the offices of the financing syndicate, lawyers were preparing a request they believed was little more than another administrative formality. Within days, that request would arrive at Ellison Property Trustees, where the answer would depend not on Daniel's title as CEO, but on an agreement he had signed and forgotten more than 20 years earlier. 2 days later, the formal request arrived at Ellison Property Trustees exactly as Margaret had expected. It came not from Daniel, but from the law firm representing the International Lending Syndicate. The request was straightforward. Before releasing nearly $900 million, the banks required confirmation that the Ashford Grand could legally serve as collateral. Margaret placed the request inside the archival conference room and invited Monica to review it. The original property deed rested beside the trust agreement, the beneficial ownership register, and Section 8.3. Nothing had changed since the day they were signed. Margaret broke the silence. The lenders are asking for trustee consent. Monica carefully read the request before turning to the restriction clause. The language was clear. The trust permitted no property held within it to be pledged as security for new debt without written approval from both the acting trustee and the beneficial owner. There were no exceptions for company founders, chief executives, or public reputation. Has anyone from Ashford Hospitality contacted you? Monica asked. Margaret shook her head. No. Their lawyers assumed management authority included trust authority. Monica set the file aside. They assumed wrong. Margaret allowed herself a faint smile. The law rarely rewards assumptions. Together, they reviewed the ownership records one final time. Daniel had signed every document voluntarily during the original acquisition. His initials appeared beside each acknowledgement, confirming that management of the operating company did not transfer ownership of trust assets. The language had never been hidden. Daniel had spent 20 years treating ownership as paperwork instead of law. Margaret prepared the trustee response. It neither approved nor rejected the financing. Instead, it stated that trustee consent could not be considered until the formal requirements of Section 8.3 had been satisfied. Without that approval, the trust property could not be pledged as collateral. Monica reviewed the wording carefully before signing the authorization. There was no declaration of victory. No emotion crossed her face. She was not changing the agreement. She was allowing it to function exactly as it had been written decades earlier. By late afternoon, the certified response left the trustee offices through secure legal courier. At Ashford Hospitality headquarters, Daniel concluded another strategy meeting with senior executives. The acquisition timeline remained on schedule, and the board expected final financing approval within days. As he walked back toward his office, his chief legal officer informed him that the lenders had requested one final trust confirmation before closing. Daniel barely slowed his pace. Routine paperwork, he replied confidently. Handle it. The attorney nodded, though something in the request troubled him. Unlike previous transactions, this one specifically referenced trustee consent under the governing ownership agreement. Daniel never asked why. He assumed every document waiting for his signature existed only to confirm what he already believed, that the Ashford Grand belonged to him. Neither man realized that, by the time the conversation ended, the trustee's response was already on its way, carrying the first official reminder that authority and ownership were never the same thing. The response reached the lending syndicate the following morning. It consisted of only a few pages, but every institution involved in the Lake Como acquisition received the same certified conclusion. The Ashford Grand remained legally owned by the trust, and under Section 8.3, the property could not be pledged as collateral until the trustee and the beneficial owner granted written consent. No accusations were made. No disputes were raised. The trustees simply confirmed the agreement exactly as it had been recorded. Within hours, the lead bank forwarded the certification to every member of the financing group. Their legal teams immediately suspended the collateral review, not because ownership was unclear, but because trustee consent remained outstanding. It was a routine compliance decision, yet one capable of delaying an acquisition worth nearly $900 million. Margaret Ellison received copies of the acknowledgments before noon. She placed them into the archive without comment. The legal process had begun moving exactly as intended. Across Manhattan, Daniel entered the executive boardroom expecting the final financing schedule. Instead, his chief financial officer placed a single memorandum in front of him. Collateral review temporarily suspended pending trustee authorization. Daniel looked up. Suspended. Only the collateral review, the CFO replied. The lenders need confirmation that the trust has approved the pledge. Daniel frowned. The hotel belongs to the company. General counsel opened the financing binder. The operating company manages the hotel. The land is held by the trust. Under Section 8.3, the trustees must approve any new secured financing involving the property. Daniel leaned back in his chair, then request the approval. The attorney hesitated. The trustees have already responded. They require the conditions of the trust to be satisfied before consent can even be considered. For the first time since the expansion began, silence settled over the room. Daniel scanned the room. None of his executives appeared alarmed, but neither did anyone dismiss the issue as insignificant. The board had approved the acquisition. Investors expected it to close. One independent director turned to Daniel and asked, "Why wasn't this restriction disclosed before the board vote?" "How long will this take?" another director asked. "We don't know," counsel answered honestly. "Until trustee authorization is resolved, the lenders won't complete the collateral package." Daniel kept his eyes on the memorandum. Only days earlier, the skyline had represented another victory waiting to happen. Now it looked strangely distant. Across the city, Monica received a brief call from Margaret. "The banks have acknowledged the trustee response," Margaret said. "No further action is required from us unless a formal request for consent is submitted." Monica ended the call and returned to her reports. She had made no demand, filed no lawsuit, and issued no public statement. The trust was simply following its own rules. That afternoon, news of an unexpected delay reached the acquisition team in Italy. The closing date remained unchanged, for now, but everyone understood the transaction could not proceed until the collateral issue was resolved. For the first time, the obstacle standing between Daniel and the largest deal of his career was not competition, market conditions, or financing. Then Daniel's phone lit up with a message from the chairman: "Emergency board session tonight." Daniel expected the issue to disappear within hours. Instead, the lender's legal department requested an emergency conference call with Ashford Hospitality Group, the financing syndicate, and outside counsel. Shortly after sunrise, the executive boardroom filled with directors, senior executives, and corporate attorneys. The atmosphere remained professional, but the confidence that had defined every previous meeting was noticeably absent. The lead banking attorney appeared on the screen first. "We have completed our review of the trustee certification," she began. "There is no dispute regarding ownership. However, the Ashford Grand cannot be accepted as collateral until the requirements of Section 8.3 have been satisfied." Daniel folded his arms. "Our company has operated that property for more than 20 years. "We agree," the attorney replied. "Operational control is not the issue. The underlying land is held by the trust, and it has not authorized its use as security for this transaction." No one answered. Daniel turned toward general counsel. "Can we replace the collateral?" The chief financial officer answered before anyone else could. "Not without restructuring the entire financing package. The Ashford Grand represents nearly 40% of the security supporting the loan." Several directors exchanged uneasy glances. Rebuilding the package could delay the acquisition for months. One independent board member leaned forward. "What happens if trustee consent isn't obtained?" The banking attorney answered without hesitation. "The lenders cannot release the funds under the current structure." The words landed harder than anyone expected. At the same moment, Daniel's communications chief received a call from a financial reporter asking why the Lake Como closing had been delayed. For the first time since the project began, the board was no longer discussing expansion. It was discussing risk. When the call ended, nobody reached for the next agenda item. Daniel turned to his legal team. "Contact the trustees immediately." General counsel nodded. "We already have. They informed us that any request must follow the procedures established in the agreement. Then prepare whatever they need." "We're doing that now." Daniel remained standing. 21 years earlier, he had signed every document believing Monica was simply protecting the family's future. He had never imagined those same documents would one day determine the future of his company. Across the city, Margaret Ellison received the formal request from Ashford Hospitality's attorneys. She reviewed it carefully before placing it beside the original trust agreement. Monica arrived a short time later. Margaret slid the request across the table. "They've officially requested trustee consent." Monica read every page before looking up. "Are all the requirements complete?" Margaret shook her head. "No. The trust requires additional disclosures before the request can even be presented for consideration." Monica slid the request back across the table. "Then respond exactly as the agreement requires." "Nothing more?" Margaret asked. Monica studied the file for a moment longer. The hotel had once been their dream. Then she closed it. "Nothing more." By late afternoon, the trustees issued their reply. It contained no rejection and no approval, only a request for the required documents before any decision could legally be made. When the response reached Ashford Hospitality headquarters, Daniel read it again. He reached the final page. The wording hadn't changed. The trustee's response was brief, formal, and impossible to misinterpret. Before the property could be pledged as collateral, the requirements had to be fully satisfied. Until then, trustee consent could not be considered. Within an hour, the lending syndicate notified the company that the collateral review would remain on hold. The acquisition itself had not been canceled, but every remaining deadline now depended on resolving the trust issue. Daniel immediately called an emergency meeting of the board. Directors who had celebrated only days earlier now reviewed updated risk reports instead of expansion forecasts. The chief financial officer projected a revised timeline onto the screen. If the collateral package isn't finalized within 14 days, he explained, the Lake Como seller has the contractual right to terminate exclusivity. The room grew noticeably quieter. One director looked toward Daniel. Can we substitute another property? The CFO shook his head, not without renegotiating the entire financing structure. The Ashford Grand is the cornerstone of the package. General Counsel added another concern. Several institutional investors have already committed capital based on the original timetable. A prolonged delay could affect their participation. 2 investors had already requested updated risk disclosures before wiring the next tranche. For the first time, Daniel felt the pressure shifting beyond lawyers and paperwork. The board had stopped discussing growth. It was now discussing exposure. After the meeting, he requested a private conference with outside counsel. Tell me exactly what the trustees want, he said. The attorney opened the trust agreement. They're not asking for anything unusual. They simply require every condition listed in Section 8.3 before they can evaluate the request. The agreement gives them no authority to bypass those requirements. He paused. And Monica? As the registered beneficial owner, she's part of the approval process. Daniel said nothing. He closed the agreement without answering. Across the city, Monica met briefly with Margaret Ellison. The trustees had received additional documents from Ashford Hospitality's legal team, but the submission remained incomplete. Margaret closed the file. They're moving quickly. Monica nodded. They should. The agreement is clear. Margaret looked at her carefully. You could make this easier. Monica answered without hesitation. The trust wasn't written to be easy. It was written to protect the property. Neither woman spoke again. There was nothing else to discuss. The agreement already contained every answer. That evening, Daniel returned to the Ashford Grand after another exhausting day of meetings. The lobby remained as elegant as ever, filled with international guests and quiet conversations. Near the concierge desk, Vanessa waited for him. She smiled, expecting dinner plans, but immediately sensed something had changed. You're late, she said gently. Daniel forced a tired smile. Business. She glanced toward the executive offices overlooking the lobby. Is everything all right? Before Daniel could answer, the elderly concierge approached Monica, who had just entered through the private residence entrance. Good evening, Mrs. Ashford, he said warmly. Several longtime employees greeted her with the same quiet respect. Vanessa watched the exchange with growing confusion. She looked back at Daniel. Why did he call her Mrs. Ashford like I wasn't standing here? Daniel had no answer. He simply watched Monica disappear toward the private elevators, carrying nothing but a slim leather portfolio. For the first time, he realized the respect surrounding her had never come from her marriage. It came from something far older, far quieter, and far more permanent than his title as CEO. Pressure spread through Ashford Hospitality faster than any public scandal could have. Within days, the Lake Como financing remained unresolved, and the delay began affecting far more than a single acquisition. The lead bank informed the company that its credit committee would postpone final approval until trustee consent had been properly resolved. Other lenders followed the same recommendation. No institution attacked Daniel publicly. They simply withdrew certainty from him, one condition letter at a time. Inside Ashford Hospitality headquarters, the board convened an emergency session. Gone were the celebratory presentations and optimistic forecasts. In their place were revised timelines, legal memoranda, and financial risk assessments. The chief financial officer addressed the room first. Every lender has reached the same conclusion. Until the collateral issue is resolved, The financing package cannot move forward. One independent director looked directly at Daniel. How exposed are we? The CFO answered without hesitation. If we miss the closing deadline, the seller has the right to terminate the agreement. We'll also lose several institutional commitments tied to the current financing structure. Nobody challenged the conclusion. Investors who once waited for Daniel's certainty now waited for the banks. For the first time, certainty belonged to the banks instead of Daniel. General Counsel distributed another memorandum. We've reviewed every alternative, he said. Replacing the collateral would require rebuilding the transaction from the beginning. That process could take months. Another director leaned forward. So everything depends on trustee approval. Yes, counsel replied. The trust controls the underlying property. We cannot bypass it. The chairman looked at Daniel. Then our largest transaction rests on an asset we never controlled. For the first time since the company was founded, the board postponed a major strategic decision because of an ownership structure almost no one had discussed in decades. The vote was unanimous. The Lake Como acquisition would remain on hold until the legal requirements were satisfied. Daniel stayed in his chair while the others quietly filed out. Around him, directors quietly gathered their files and left the room without offering congratulations or reassurance. No one blamed him. They simply accepted that the transaction could not continue under the existing conditions. Across the city, Monica spent the afternoon reviewing scholarship applications at the foundation. Margaret Ellison called only once. The board has suspended the acquisition until the trust requirements are resolved. Monica thanked her for the update. Has anyone challenged the trust? She asked. No, Margaret replied. Every institution has accepted the agreement exactly as written. Monica ended the call and returned to her work. The system required nothing further from her. It was functioning precisely as it had been designed more than 20 years earlier. That evening, Vanessa waited for Daniel inside the presidential collection. Dinner had gone untouched. When he finally arrived, exhaustion had replaced the confidence she had admired only weeks before. Did the deal fall apart? She asked quietly. Daniel loosened his tie but did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked through the windows toward the lights of the city below. Not yet, he said at last. Vanessa hesitated before asking the question that had been troubling her for days. If you're in charge, why does everyone keep saying they need someone else's approval? Daniel had no answer. Downstairs, the Ashford Grand continued operating. Exactly as it always had. Guests checked in. Employees welcomed arrivals. The chandeliers still illuminated the marble lobby, and the hotel's name still stood proudly above the entrance. Yet for the first time, Daniel understood that running the building and truly controlling its future had never been the same thing. 48 hours later, the deadline arrived. The financing syndicate held its final credit committee meeting, but without completed trustee authorization, the Lake Como package could not advance. Before the session ended, the lead bank issued a formal notice to every participating institution. The transaction would remain suspended until the collateral requirements had been fully satisfied. The decision was procedural, not personal, yet its consequences were immediate. Inside headquarters, the board gathered once again. This time, there were no expansion renderings on the screens, only revised financial projections. The chief financial officer spoke first. The seller has exercised its contractual rights. Our exclusivity period expires at midnight tomorrow unless funding is confirmed. A director quietly asked the question everyone had been avoiding. Can we still close? Outside counsel answered with professional restraint. Not under the current structure. Without trustee consent, the Ashford Grand cannot secure the loan. Without the collateral, the lenders cannot release the funds. Nobody spoke. Months of negotiations, international travel, and strategic planning had been reduced to a single unresolved condition contained in a trust agreement signed more than 2 decades earlier. The chairman closed the folder. The Lake Como acquisition is suspended. Daniel, the board will appoint a transaction committee to review all collateral approvals going forward. The motion passed unanimously. No one challenged Daniel's leadership, but for the first time, the board had taken control of the company's largest initiative out of his hands. When the meeting ended, Daniel remained alone in the boardroom. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the Ashford Grand rising above the city, the building everyone believed belonged to him. He lowered the file without saying a word. Across town, Monica met briefly with Margaret Ellison. The board has suspended the acquisition, Margaret said, placing the latest notice into the trust archive. The lenders have closed the current financing file. Monica accepted the notice. There was no satisfaction in her expression. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to remember that dream. Then she closed the archive file. As she prepared to leave, Margaret returned the original property deed to its climate-controlled case. "Everything is back where it belongs," she said. Monica smiled faintly. It never left. That evening, Vanessa packed her belongings inside the presidential collection. As hotel staff prepared the suite for its next guest, she watched employees greet Monica with the same quiet respect they had always shown her. No announcement had been made. No confrontation had taken place. Yet Vanessa removed the guest credential from her purse before leaving. She had mistaken access for authority. Without a word, she collected her luggage and left the hotel alone. Upstairs, the suite stood empty. Downstairs, the Ashford Grand continued exactly as it always had, unchanged by headlines, untouched by appearances, and anchored by ownership that had quietly outlasted them all. 3 weeks later, the Ashford Grand welcomed another evening of diplomats, entrepreneurs, and international travelers. Nothing about the hotel suggested that the largest transaction in the company's history had quietly collapsed. The chandeliers still reflected across polished marble. The concierge still greeted guests by name. The orchestra still played beneath the grand staircase. The building had continued exactly as it always had, untouched by headlines or corporate setbacks. Daniel arrived shortly before noon, carrying a leather portfolio that contained every document his legal team had reviewed over the past several weeks. He had searched for an overlooked amendment, a forgotten resolution, or a missing signature that might change the outcome. None existed. Every record led back to the same conclusion. Ashford Hospitality Group operated the hotel. The trust owned the land beneath it. Inside a private conference room overlooking the lobby, representatives from the lending syndicate, the title insurer, Ashford Hospitality's legal team, and Ellison property trustees gathered for one final administrative meeting. Margaret Ellison reviewed the closing memorandum before sliding a familiar archival case across the table. She opened it carefully and removed the original property deed, preserved exactly as it had been since the day the hotel was acquired. "The financing file has been formally closed," she said. "Institutional records now reflect the ownership structure exactly as established under the trust." Monica acknowledged the statement with a quiet nod. She signed the trustee's final acknowledgement confirming that the records had been updated. Margaret returned the original deed to Monica. "The original has been returned to its beneficial owner," she said. Monica accepted the document with both hands, looked at it for a long moment, then placed it gently back into its archival case. She neither displayed it nor celebrated it. Daniel watched silently. For the first time, he remembered the afternoon he had signed those same papers more than 20 years earlier. He had believed they were ordinary legal formalities. Monica had understood they were the foundation of everything they were building together. She had never taken anything from him. She had simply protected what they had created before success convinced him protection was no longer necessary. The meeting ended without argument. The system had reached its conclusion without anger, accusation, or revenge. As Monica stepped into the lobby, the elderly concierge greeted her with a warm smile. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ashford." She thanked him before stopping beside the glass display containing the hotel's original skeleton key. "Please return the original key to the archive," she said quietly. "It belongs with the deed." The concierge nodded with quiet understanding. The key returned to the archive beside the deed. Across the lobby, Vanessa passed through the entrance carrying a single suitcase. She paused for only a moment as she watched employees greet Monica with effortless respect. No announcement had ever declared Monica the owner. No headline had ever celebrated her authority. Vanessa lowered her eyes and walked out into the city without looking back. Daniel remained where he was. The documents had never changed. Neither had the deed. Monica closed the archival case over the original deed. The latch clicked. Around Daniel, nothing had changed. Guests arrived. Staff welcomed them. Elevators continued their endless rhythm. No one applauded, and no one needed to.